makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Donald Trump says Russia will face consequences if Vladimir Putin does not agree to a ceasefire with Ukraine later this week. It comes as the U.S. president prepares to meet his counterpart in Alaska tomorrow.
Yes, they will. Yeah.
What will the consequences
there will be
be?
consequences.
Sanctions, tariffs?
There will be, I don't have to say, there will be very severe consequences.
Well, President Trump also said he hoped to use the Friday meeting to set up a quick second meeting with Ukraine leader Vladimir Zelenskiy after Western allies pressed him to push for such a summit. Now, we're now joined by our very own Rosalind Matheson. Roz, so why is President Trump now so tough on Vladimir Putin?
Well, he's sounding tough, but the question is actually, is he going to be tough on Vladimir Putin? I mean, he's swung in so many different directions so far when it comes to the Russian leader. Sort of warmth and admiration and then frustration and irritation. A lot of it is really just stemming from the fundamental reality that Donald Trump came to power saying he would get a very quick ceasefire in Russia's war against Ukraine. And it's now August and we still don't have one, in the sense that perhaps he's been strung along by the Russian leader. But at the same time, he can't quite bring himself to be that tough on Vladimir Putin, because while he's talked about cracking down on Russian exports of oil, including especially to India, he's really not looking to penalise China for that. So what does he mean by consequences if there's not a ceasefire agreement out of this meeting that's going to happen in Alaska? So yeah, he's sounding tough, and he's probably wanting to show Vladimir Putin ahead of their sit down that he's coming in ready to be tough if needed. And his rhetoric has shifted a bit. He's talking now about it being more of a feeling out exercise versus coming out with a whole lot of understandings around land, for example. So perhaps he wants to show Vladimir Putin he's not going to be a pushover in this conversation, but equally several hours on the ground in Alaska with, someone who's a very astute political operator in Vladimir Putin, who knows what's actually going to come out of the conversation versus what we're seeing going in.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you, Roz, is there a danger that, Donald Trump changes his mind after meeting with Vladimir Putin?
Well, certainly anything's possible again out of that conversation. I mean, there's so many moving parts here. You have Russia saying that they'll only agree to a ceasefire if there are understandings already about land, which is essentially Ukraine ceding territory to Russia as part of just getting a ceasefire. You have Ukraine and its European allies saying, hang on, you can't put the cart before the horse. The first thing we need to have is a ceasefire, freeze the conflict where it is, and then we can have conversations about the broader parameters of a peace deal, including that very, very tricky issue of territory. Of course, even freezing the conflict in place is a bit of a win for Russia, because their troops get to stay there occupying that land for even longer. But there's all these differences about what this meeting might be designed to achieve. Is it simply to get Russia and Ukraine towards the table, to get Russia to agree for Vladimir Putin to sit down with the Ukrainian leader directly and have those conversations? Is it to come out of it with an understanding for a ceasefire? Is it to go even further on some of those parameters for a peace deal, particularly, again, land? And so with all those changeables in the air, it's hard to know going into that conversation again what will happen in the minute. And Donald Trump is very quick to agree to things and change his mind. So is there the risk that he just goes in a direction in this conversation that's not a particularly good result for Ukraine?
Ross, I have 1,000,001 questions about this and other stories, but I thought it was very striking to have the Treasury Secretary of the U.S., Scott Bessent, in a long and great interview on Bloomberg yesterday, also weighing in on the BOJ. I mean, I've never, once again, heard a Treasury Secretary weigh on monetary policy of a foreign country.
Well, quite startling to see that, and to be so direct about essentially saying where he thinks Japan needs to be taking interest rates. And as part of that, really attempting more likely to be jawboning the US currency. Obviously, he wants the US dollar to be going in a certain direction, and where Japanese rates are has a real impact on that. And, the US has commented before about where they think the yen is going or where it should be going, but quite extraordinary to see him saying that about the BOJ. And the question is, what does that mean for the BOJ? There's a conversation about whether the BOJ may move on rates as soon as October. But if they do hike rates, is that going to be seen as them bowing to pressure from outside to do so? Has he put them in a corner where if they do move on rates or they feel they need to move on rates, they're going to be, accused of responding simply to where the US wanted rates to be? So it puts the BOJ in a really delicate position. And as you say, another reminder that this administration does feel quite free to comment on a whole lot of different things, their own central bank, but also where rates are for other countries overseas.
Ros, thank you so much. As always, Ros Matheson, their chief Asia correspondent. Now, Scott Bessent has made his most explicit call yet for the Fed to begin a cycle of deep cuts to U.S. interest rates. Speaking to Bloomberg, Bessent said the current central bank leadership has been taking too much of an old-fashioned approach to monetary policy.
President Trump is very good at giving these nicknames, and I think the reason that the Jay Powell gets the nickname too late is because he wants to go into a series of rate hikes. He's not willing. He's not Alan Greenspan, who was very forward thinking. They try to be more data driven, which I think is a mistake, because I think we are going back into an economy like we had in the 90s. So, it's just very old fashioned thinking. But I do think we could go into a series of rate cuts here, starting with a 50 basis point rate cut in September.
A 50 basis rate cut in September. Does that signal that the economy, though, is not doing well?
That signals that there's an adjustment and the rates are too constrictive. If you look at any model, that we should probably be 150, 175 basis points lower. So, I think the committee needs to step back. I think probably one of the most politicized governors just went off the board, and that she was very, very political, I believe. And I think that
what did she do that gave you that impression? I'd love to know.
Sorry?
I imagine you're referring to Governor Kugler. What did she do that gave you that impression?
I think there's a lot of inside baseball. And look, Governor Kugler, you read what she was saying when Kamala Harris was running, that we needed rate cuts, we needed this, we got to foam the runway, and then all of a sudden it was hard to know whether TDS was a Trump dementia syndrome or Trump derangement syndrome or tariff derangement syndrome.
You get the opportunity to remake the Federal Reserve. The president gets the opportunity to reshape the Federal Reserve. And I'm not talking about the remodeling that maybe the current chairman's going through. We'll talk about that another time. I want to talk about the complexion and character of the committee. The changes that you're making at the moment. Stephen Myron, let's start with Stephen. How quickly can you get Myron confirmed?
We'll see. The president has great sway with Leader Thune. Leader Thune's been a great partner during the tax deal, and I think that he would like to see Stephen, who I've known for a long time, get on there as soon as possible. So I'm hopeful about the September meeting. And Jonathan, the president's concerned about the building and those massive cost overrun, which just tell you that there is no accountability at that organization. There's no oversight in terms of the spending, but the president and I are both concerned about the foundations of the Fed.
Scott Bessent, there, the Treasury Secretary, speaking to Surveillance. It was a great interview that you can go, of course, and listen to in full. Let's bring in Themistocleous, EMEA, Chief Investment Officer, Office Head at UBS Global Wealth Management. Themis, thank you for joining us. Look, just straight off the bat, where do you think the Fed interest rate should be?
Yeah, it is our view that the Fed will cut 100 basis points over the next 12 months, starting in September. Obviously, the Fed has quite a balancing act. The economy is clearly slowing down, but at the same time is not heading for recession. At least that's not our view. At the same time, inflation is picking up, despite the CPI surprising positively the last reading. It's still the trend is inflation is going up, and we're seeing concrete signs of tariffs having an impact on goods pricing. So they need to consider both parts of the equation. And I think the track and the direction is towards more cuts, but gradual ones.
But, Themis, if there is a cut in September, how political will that be, given what the Treasury Secretary and others have been saying on the committee?
I don't envy Powell, right? He needs to sort of balance this what appears to be external pressure to cut rates versus what's happening to fundamentals. And I do think he's got to do what he thinks is right based on what he sees the fundamentals playing out. And at the end of the day, we heard from the previous clip that the government is now pushing for 50 basis points. Is that warranted by the economy? I don't think so. So I think it's got to be balancing all of that, and it's got to be driven by what happens in the fundamentals rather than external pressure from government.
But Themis, I keep on hearing, look, the worries about stagflation, the fact that it could actually, this is a nightmare for central banks and policymakers in general to deal with. Does a 50 basis point cut in September put us in a position where actually, stagflation could not materialize?
Or make it worse, right? Because if you cut interest rates too early and the economy is still robust, the risk you run is that you have underlying inflation picking up at the same time when there is pressure from tariffs on pricing. Then, yes, maybe the economy starts you cushion the weaker economy, but you fuel inflation, and then you have to, what is the next step? Then you go back increasing rates again to fight inflation. So you can look shorter or you can look longer term. And I think what makes sense to us is a gradual decline in interest rates, and that gives the Fed this ability to react if inflation does pick up significantly, not just in goods inflation, but if that starts translating into services inflation, which might be more sticky and more enduring.
Themis, does the dollar weaken from here?
It is our view that the dollar continues to weaken. We see the dollar trading in a range of 115 to 120 versus the euro to the end of the year. And then we see further weakness as we go into the first half of next year in the range of 120 to 125. If you look at the two central banks, the Fed, we think will cut at least 4 times. With the ECB, we think they'll cut once, maybe pause and they'll cut once. Clearly, the rate differential will narrow between the U.S. and Europe, but also that similar logic applies with the dollar, with some of the other developed market currencies as well. But the euro dollar, we definitely see the euro strengthening versus the dollar over the next 12 months.
Themis, how do you play all of this actually when it comes to currencies? I know you mentioned like euro dollar. Is there another way to play it?
Well, so euro dollar is one way you can think about the dollar versus the Australian dollar as well. Again, that's another way to play the weakness in the dollar. The Bank of Australia, we don't think is going to cut as much as the Fed. And then again, similar dynamics apply, and we do see the dollar weakening versus the Aussie dollar as well.
Themis, when you look at all of the earnings that we've seen, everything seems to be supported by AI and tech. How does that play into the economy in ways that maybe we haven't foreseen yet? Does it really boost productivity? Is Scott Bessent right when the way that we're looking at the economy, is it outdated?
It's a very good question and very topical, right? Because if you look at the level of the stock market, if you look at expectations, if you look at valuations, clearly the market is expecting some productivity improvement over the next few years. And I think the market is right to look at it that way. I think if we think about our personal experience, let's take smartphones. That made our life a lot more efficient. We work in whether we are on the plane or whether on the train. So it's just we are working a lot longer, if you think about it, than we did before the invention of the smart mobile phones. And AI is going to be maybe a multiple impact relative to what happened with smartphones. So I would expect productivity improvement over the years, and that would support the economy for sure. Against that, of course, we have to remember that most probably with deglobalization, we most probably see some upward pressure on costs over time. So you've got to see some of that benefit eroded by some other dynamics out there. But net, I do believe that artificial intelligence will lead to significant improvement in the economy in the coming years. And I don't think it's a surprise to the market. As I said earlier on, if we look at valuations, I think reflect some of that.
Yeah, so interesting. I know we'll talk about this for a lot longer. Themis, thank you, as always. Themistocleous, their EMEA CIO office head at UBS Global Wealth Management. Now to the tech space, and the FT is reporting that the Chinese AI company DeepSeek has delayed the release of its new model after failing to train it using Huawei's chips. Well, let's get more with Tom McKenzie. Tom, as always, thank you. So is this a story on DeepSeek, or is it just that Nvidia once again is killing it?
I think there's a broader story here. One, it reminds us that there is this innovation gap, and China has made significant progress in terms of producing chips for AI and an ecosystem that can support their large language models, but there remains a gap in terms of what they are able to do with US-made chips versus Chinese-made chips. And there's a reminder of that. So DeepSeek delaying a model that they had hoped to release back in May. It was going to be the R2. They've been under pressure, frankly, from the Chinese government to train this model, train it on Huawei's chips. They've been using Huawei's chips for inference. That's when we actually use and interact with the model. The training, which is the earlier part of this piece, was done on, or at least attempted, on Huawei's Ascend chips, and they've struggled with that. Their previous model was trained on Nvidia chips. So will they resort now back to Nvidia chips? That remains a question. There's a clear tension. The Chinese government wants their big AI companies to be using Huawei's chips, but Huawei's chips are not delivering, particularly when it comes to training, so they're still going to be reaching arguably unlikely for those US options, at least for now. The H20 we know can be sold into the Chinese market now, if, of course, Nvidia or AMD, with the equivalent, gives that 15% to the US Treasury. So it reminds us of two things. One, there is still this catch-up. A lot of progress has been made, but they still are struggling if they don't have the highest performing chips.
Tom, Apple also continuing to push to get back into this Gen AI race. What do we know? Will it work?
Yeah, this is catch up for Apple. The stock is down about 10% year to date. They're going to come out with hardware devices next year, a smart speaker with a screen, and then the year after that, 2027, this is really going to be the linchpin for them, is this robotic arm with a screen that might follow you around the house or the room. If that makes you feel uncomfortable, you may not be alone in that.
If it's doing the cleaning, I'm fine.
Yeah, maybe they'll add the cleaning component. That's important. We'll send a message to Tim Cook and co. It's going to come down to the software as well. Siri, as you may know, doesn't really have that AI ability that many of us are now kind of used to in terms of its user experience. They need to get the software ready, and they're trying to build out their own large language models. The hardware is in progress. If they can get the software aligned with that hardware, then maybe they can get back in the game when it comes to AI for Apple.
Perhaps Siri could look at the mental load. Right?
That would be helpful. Take some of that mental load off us, as well as the cleaning.
There you go, Tom. Thank you so much. Tom McKenzie there with the very latest on tech and AI. Now, the next edition of Bloomberg Tech Europe with Tom airs tomorrow. He'll be exploring how AI is changing the way we work, and that's at 6:30 a.m. London time. Coming up, better than expected GDP figures for the UK. But does that mean interest rate cuts are actually coming? Well, we'll discuss that next with Victoria Clarke, UK Chief Economist at Santander CIB. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, the UK economy fared better than expected in the second quarter, with GDP rising 0.3%. The news brings some relief for the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, but raises the bar for further interest rate cuts from the Bank of England. Well, with us this morning, Victoria Clarke, UK Chief Economist at Santander CIB. Victoria, as always, thank you for being here. I mean, I just feel like the UK picture for the economy is actually quite complicated.
It's really complicated. Look, we're heading to a period of inflation moving further above target, 4% CPI. We've got a jobs market that's softening, but for complicated reasons. And now we've got, GDP figures that says, well, look, maybe it's not too bad, but it's not too bad because, government spending's quite high. So that's quite a difficult set of factors. And certainly, for the Bank of England, that makes their job pretty tough.
Yeah, and I think, it's always a good reminder. A lot of the pressures that, are within the economy, certainly on the labour market, are also because of the policies put in place by the government, right? Because of what they want to do. So you have the external pressures coming from tariffs, but also some of the things, when it comes to wages and NICs that Labour put in place.
I think labour costs are an important part of the story. That's certainly been something that we've been seeing where we look at the squeeze in the labour market. There's a structural change that's happening there. So it seems less appealing to have people on headcounts, and certainly the feeling that self-employment's more appealing. So I think that's an important part of the picture for sure. That's potentially, an inflationary part of the picture. So the jobs market may be loosening, but it's not clear that that's necessarily an outright dovish signal for the Bank of England. So they must be wary of that. And look, as I said, I mean, you cannot ignore the fact that the optics of inflation are really ugly right now. You know, the prospect of 4%. And for households, you know, inflation on the food side's pushing up. So all of these things are going to be triggering those concerns that you might see coming back to the labour market, more calls for, you know, still fairly big wage increases. So it's a tough old outlook to grapple with. I mean, look, maybe the easiest option for the Bank of England actually is now for a period to do nothing. And that's certainly our call, that they should sit tight, take no risks when you've got such high, sticky inflation.
I mean, is it because the danger of cutting too soon or is actually more risky than actually just waiting?
I think that's right. I mean, I think for me, the combination of these factors is complicated, but the high inflation at the moment, I think, is front and centre, especially when you look at the causes of the softening in the jobs market. The GDP figures are not bad enough to warrant a rush to do it. So I think the sensible strategy from here is probably sit tight. If that jobs market keeps on weakening, then you come back later and you cut a bit faster. And I think the balance of risks, to me, suggests that that would be the safest path for them to choose.
Victoria, what's the data print that actually you really want to know in the next couple of months?
So certainly, you know, the kind of ugly details of the CPI numbers. I think, you know, is it 4? Does CPI push through 4 with those food inflation concerns? That's a risk. I think that'd be important. I mean, starting to push past 4 is really quite psychologically important. And then in the labour market, you know, it's not just for me about payrolls, you know, do they keep softening? It's that bigger picture, because if people are still finding work in other areas, then maybe the crisis is not all that. Of course, pay growth's a big data point. I mean, does that really get a good 3 handle and continue to soften?
Yeah, and then of course you have the budget, which we don't have a date for. So there's an assumption that it's towards the later part of the fall. But again, the money's just not there for the government to find. What are you expecting in the budget?
Yeah, I mean, look, today's growth figures, I think, help them
a little bit. Yeah,
they do. They help them. You know, they're not going to get such a downside from some of those assumptions. They have made some policy changes already, which they have to find money for. You know, the welfare bill is one. And there's a key question there, which is what the OBR is going to come out and say about productivity growth. So that's leading to economists coming out with very big ranges of numbers from they'll need to, you know, borrow or tax more of the tune of, you know, something quite small to up to, you know, 40, 50 billion. In my sense, it's probably towards the lower end of that, 20 billion probably at the upper end, though that is not necessarily an easy task, even if you end up in that sort of ballpark.
Is there any low-hanging fruit? I'd say that they can tax without putting the economy in jeopardy.
But there are a few things. I mean, the obvious one is going to be the freeze on tax thresholds, which they can push out. That will get them, you know, part of the way there. And then I think the other things that they'll need to do will be, will be slightly more important. You know, there's lots of talk about inheritance tax at the moment. There's talk about gambling taxes. And I suspect the way that they deal with this is just kind of scraping around a range of taxes rather than, you know, doing anything big or significant that, you know, really challenges the economy.
Victoria, thank you so much. As always, Victoria Clarke there, UK Chief Economist at Santander CIB. Coming up, we talk about Russia and the US. This is Bloomberg. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. President Trump warns of severe consequences for Russia without a ceasefire agreement on Ukraine, while promising to push for a second meeting that includes Vladimir Zelenskiy. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the Bank of Japan is falling behind the curve on inflation in a rare comment on policy decisions by a foreign central bank. Plus, the UK economy grows faster than expected, bringing some relief for the Chancellor Rachel Reeves and questions for the BOE's rate path ahead. Now let's return to that top story. And Donald Trump has warned Russia will face consequences if Vladimir Putin does not agree to a ceasefire with Ukraine in the coming days. Now the U.S. president is due to meet with the Russian leader in Alaska tomorrow. We're joined by Stephanie Baker, a senior writer, and Peter Trubowitz, professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. So Stephanie, Professor, thank you for being here. Stephanie, I mean, I don't know whether it's the communication, actually, that the leaders or the pressure that leaders put on Donald Trump. But again, it's a different tone when he speaks about Vladimir Putin. Now it's a lot more threatening. Could he go back to the more friendly President Trump once they meet in Alaska?
Yeah, and this is the problem with Trump, is that he seems to echo the last person he spoke with. So he's taking a firm line on Putin now, going into this meeting after this confab with European leaders, and they have kind of warned him of their red lines, and it seems to have persuaded Trump to get on their page in terms of ceasefire before any territorial negotiations, and no discussion of land swaps without Ukraine at the table. But I think out of that meeting, there was a very significant concession, it appears. Macron said that Trump had agreed that any deal would also entail U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine, which, as we know, Trump had been resisting. So I do think that is a significant shift if he sticks to it. But, a lot is riding on this meeting. The warning of consequences, I assume, is additional sanctions on Russia. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, talked about that yesterday, warning of sanctions. So I think by Monday we could be back talking about what are the next sanctions measures he could take.
Yeah, and Stephanie, we were talking yesterday about what Vladimir Putin wants out of this. I mean, if he comes in and with a very tough Donald Trump, I mean, what does he like? His game theory has probably changed after hearing Donald Trump speak yesterday, or has it?
I think he's still going to go in and hope that getting him one-on-one in a room, as I understand, there are going to be no additional advisors, just translators. He'll be able to charm Trump, maybe offer him some deal related to, Russia-U.S. business opportunities, critical minerals, and get him to agree to some kind of framework that would involve territorial concessions that then Zelensky cannot accept. Yeah. And that he's then won the day by presenting Zelensky as the obstacle to peace as opposed to Putin. This is a win for Putin. He's, been welcomed back into the fold after 3.5 years of isolation. So just the meeting itself, raises his stature at home. Mm-hmm. And I think he thinks he can get a deal. I mean, in reality, the Russian economy is in a terrible state. And that is one of the factors that is driving him to this. Yeah. I think he does feel like he needs to do a deal because the economy is slowing down and oil revenues are dropping.
Yeah. Which I want to talk about in a second because we have a great story actually explaining exactly what's going on. Professor, why do you think, this was put together quite fast. Mm-hmm. Why?
Well, I think it was actually dropped in Trump's lap by Putin. Putin proposed it, and I think they decided to go for it, and I think for two reasons, probably. One is that, Trump is on record saying he, once he was in office, he could cut a deal over the Ukraine war within 24 hours. I think part of what's going on here is Trump wanting to be the peacemaker, wanting to make good on it. But, when you're talking about Trump, you always have to think about, have to keep in mind what he's trying to avoid as well as what he's trying to achieve. He's got problems domestically. He's got lousy poll numbers. He's got pushback, over the Epstein files. And there's a backlash in the heartland over the big, beautiful bill. So Trump, I think, is putting a lot of things out there, and this was an opportunity to, as he has had other opportunities as well, that he sees to change the narrative. So
this would be a distraction for
partly a distraction.
Media.
There's high risk, though, involved. He's walking in, as Stephanie just said, into a negotiation that could go in directions that he's not, necessarily ready for. Trump said he will know within 2 minutes of a discussion with Vladimir Putin whether there's a deal. The way I interpret that is he will know very quickly whether or not there's a ceasefire deal to be had. And if not, I suspect, and Stephanie raised this at the very end, that he will go down a different path. And that path will be about normalizing relations between the U.S. and Russia.
But, Professor, again, if he's doing this because he wants to be a peacemaker, because he wants the Nobel Peace Prize, then he can't agree to any deal. Right? The lens on which I guess European leaders have possibly told them, like, this is how you get the prize, is not by normalizing a situation with Russia.
Yeah, perhaps, but the Europeans are in the caboose. He's in the locomotive here. And Trump will spin anything that comes out of there, frame it in such a way that it's a win, which means everybody has to pause and scrutinize it because, as so often with these deals, the devil's in the detail.
Yeah.
And but so, yes, if he throws Ukraine under the bus, he is going to have trouble with European leaders. There's no doubt about that.
And getting that peace prize. Do we know if the two leaders still like each other?
Putin and Trump.
Yeah.
They have had years of warm relations. I mean, he has attacked leaders around the world for far less, and he's been so careful in his language about Putin until the last couple of months, where he's finally realized that he has been played, that Putin is intransigent on this war. How long that will last, I think, remains to be seen, because he does seem to have this sympathy with Putin and perhaps looks at him and admires him as a strongman leader that he emulates in some respects.
Does it help with his strongman reputation back home? Or is there also backlash within the Republican Party about his possible closeness to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I would say a lot depends on what happens tomorrow. I mean, if he comes away with a deal that looks like he has appeased Putin at Kiev's expense, that's going to cost him in Europe, and it's also going to cost him to some degree with, let's say, independent voters in the United States. It will not cost him. It will not cost him with true believers in the MAGA coalition who want him to normalize relations with Moscow.
But not with China.
Not necessarily with China, but certainly with Putin. I'm talking the Tucker Carlsons and so forth, who are kind of all in the tank on that. So I don't. But I think for those average voters in the United States who are paying attention, and that's a big qualifier right there, a bad deal would not go over real well.
Stephanie, what can you tell us about, again, the Russia economy? We have a deep dive really explaining what Vladimir Putin is faced with, especially as the U.S. and Donald Trump said they would put actually secondary sanctions on India for buying Russian oil.
Well, we do think that these threat of secondary sanctions did spur Putin to come to the table, that it is having an effect because Russian oil revenues are dropping. So any additional pressure on oil profits to the Russian budget will have an impact. The Russian economy is struggling after years of record spending on the war, which boosted growth. The economy is now slowing. It has the biggest budget deficit in more than 3 decades, high inflation, high interest rates, and we have reported that there's concern within the banking sector that bad loans are rising, in part because of these measures that Putin adopted right after the war to allow preferential lending by banks to defense enterprises. And I think that is starting to come home and put pressure on the Russian economy. I'm not saying the Russian economy is going to collapse, in the immediate future, but it's not looking as rosy for Putin. He is looking like he's running out of road to continue to finance the war at the current rate he's doing. Right, the current defense budget accounts for about 8% of GDP, which is a huge amount. When you talk about the struggles that Europe has engaged in to try to get defense spending up to 2-3%, Russia is spending huge amounts on this war, and it can't continue to do that forever. So you have these pressures on Putin to try to keep this going, and any additional sanctions is not going to help him. The sanctions regime, as I have written about in my book, was full of holes. It has slowed Russia down. It has cost Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. But any additional moves by the Trump administration, particularly on Russian oil, I think would be detrimental to Putin's ability to continue this war.
Stephanie, I guess what a lot of commentators are struggling to find is a compromise where everyone's okay with it. I mean, is there in your mind a compromise where, Ukraine doesn't give any up, any like sovereign territory, and Putin accepts it?
I think that's what Ukraine wants, is a ceasefire along the current lines of control, as well as no concessions on, for instance, Russia's demand that Ukraine not join NATO, or that it not have security guarantees from NATO as part of any deal. But I don't think that's what Putin wants. And they've just reiterated that they want control of the 4 regions of Ukraine that they have annexed but don't actually control on the ground. And there's just no way Ukraine is going to sign up to that, right? I mean, they're not going to agree to just hand over territory to Russia that the Russians have spent years trying to gain control of on the ground at huge costs. So I don't see, that happening. And I don't even see that happening if the U.S. agrees to it. The Europeans will not, because it affects their own long-term security. They view this as existential to Europe's future, that Ukraine can't be seen to lose.
Professor, what would be, if not ideal outcome, a good outcome, actually, given that, President Trump, I think only 2 days ago, was also saying, look, expectations for the summit are not very high.
Well, I mean, that's kind of normal White House spin prior to the summit to dampen expectations and so forth. So, I think if you got a ceasefire on terms that were acceptable to Kiev, I think that would broadly be viewed as a win. It would mean it's a climb down for Putin to get to that position. But if he were willing to go to that, I'm very skeptical. I mean, it's really a reversal of his position to do that. But he's he's got enough license to be able.
Is that Putin calling?
I'm sure it's
who's listening in?
I don't think I'm on his Rolodex or whatever it is. Just lost the train of thought. But I think that...
No, that he wouldn't reverse. You were saying
yeah, I don't think he would reverse. But if Trump were to be able to engineer something like that in Anchorage, in a short summit, I think people would be surprised. And I think probably broadly welcome something that Kiev was happy with. I mean, it is worth noting that at the end of that meeting yesterday, Zelenskiy was very happy about what he had heard. So
the problem is that let's see if it stays, right?
Yes, indeed.
Who talks to the president from now until then. Thank you both for joining us. Stephanie Baker, a senior writer, and Peter Trubowitz, a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. Now, also, everyone should read more on this topic in Stephanie's book, Punishing Putin, and it's a really clever book looking at the way that Vladimir Putin also masterminded the economy, enabled to go to war. Leaders from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have threatened to reimpose UN sanctions on Iran if a nuclear deal is not reached by the end of August. Now, the so-called E3 say they are prepared to trigger what they described as a snapback mechanism to reinstate international sanctions on Iran. Those sanctions were lifted under the 2015 nuclear deal. And South Sudan's government has denied reports it's in talks with Israel about relocating Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to the East African nation. Well, the Associated Press has reported the two nations are discussing a resettlement as part of a wider effort by Israel to facilitate mass immigration from the enclave. Now, South Sudan's foreign ministry issued a statement describing the claims as baseless. Coming up, big waves across the high seas. The chief executive of shipping firm Hapag-Lloyd tells Bloomberg that U.S. trade tariffs have led to what he calls a rocky year. We'll hear from him next, and this is Bloomberg. Well, the chief executive of Hapag-Lloyd says U.S. tariffs have led to a rocky year for the shipping and container firm. Rolf Haben-Jansen told us that continuing tariff talks between China and the U.S. are having a significant impact on the industry.
When we were talking to many of our customers over the last 4 weeks, everybody said that there would be no uptick in volume. But when I look at what's been happening, let's say also especially over the last couple of days, we certainly see a bit of an uptick compared to what we saw in the last weeks. But I think to talk about a rush is definitely exaggerated.
Well, Rolf, put that into perspective, that this uptick that you are seeing, Are you expecting still some tariff front running to continue until some sort of deal between the U.S. and China is finally reached? We were speaking to the Maersk CEO last week, and his main case was that we need certainty on the U.S.-China relationship for shipping to really boom back.
And I tend to agree with him. I mean, everybody, and when you talk, whether you talk to shippers or whether you talk to importers, everybody would like to know where they are. That's, of course, where now the extended 90-day pause, if you want, or standstill is in a way good news, because that'll help people to at least get through the peak season. That's also why I would expect to still see a mini rush, if you want, towards the Golden Week, and as such a fairly normal seasonal pattern. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, everybody needs to get some long-term certainty, because when the markets become predictable, people will simply take more decisions, as there's too many people right now in a wait-and-see mode, which over time does not have a good effect on demand. And that's where a little bit more certainty and a little bit more predictability, I think, would help everyone.
Well, that was Rolf Haben-Jansen, the chief executive of Hapag-Lloyd. Now we're joined by Brendan Murray, who leads our trade and supply chain coverage. You're our trade czar. I mean, there's a lot going on. I can't figure out, actually, if you look at the tariff truce between U.S. and China, I mean, does it automatically bring trade rush ahead of the deadline and then quietens down? Is it like really zigzagged?
Yeah, well, you just heard him say that there's a mini rush going on, and right. I think it feeds into this overall storyline that we've seen play out over the year, that things are just so unpredictable. Tariffs are on, tariffs are off, yeah. Truces are extended, they escalate, and so what I think the picture he's painting here is one where there's a little bit more certainty, but there's still these clouds hanging over the global economy, and many of those are geopolitical. He also talked about the Red Sea diversions. Those are now going to extend into a third year. He said we're not going through the Red Sea for the rest of the year. The U.S.-China situation is stable, but it's still uncertain. And so I think that the companies that are on the front lines of the trade war, like Hapag-Lloyd, are really not in the clear yet.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, like, if you look at the routes, it's like Trans-Pacific, Transatlantic, and again, they have to move fast. These are, I imagine, typically not global shippers that are used to moving fast, because it depends on where you have your ships and the containers. I mean, it doesn't just happen. It's not like shipping something on Amazon. Exactly. They can't turn capacity on and off, and so it takes months to sort of adjust things. So I think they've been resilient in the face of these headwinds and these disruptions, but it's still disruption that's costly. Sailing around Africa it takes longer. It keeps a floor on freight rates. So I think that there's also the demand side of the equation. Are they going to see slowdowns in Europe and the U.S.? And he indicated that they don't see recessions in the U.S. or Europe in the foreseeable future, but a slowdown is definitely in the outlook. If you look at what freight rates are doing, they're coming down. He said they've been flat for the past couple of weeks, and so it's just a continuation of what we've seen, disruptions and headwinds in the 3 to 6 month outlook. Brendan, what did you find as most interesting, actually, in what he had to say? And again, we hear also from the other side, chief executives having to make, especially in retail, having to make a decision. Look, you need to ship 100,000, shirts. Do you want to do it tomorrow at this cost? Yeah, exactly. I was sort of surprised by his cautious optimism in the face of all of this. He indicated that they had pretty decent growth in the first half of the year, and that they would wind up for the full year with something in the range of I think he said 2 to 4% growth. That is more optimistic than the World Trade Organization is seeing. It expects merchandise trade to grow less than 1% this year. So anything above that is you've got to take away as a positive. But he still he balanced his statements pretty well to say we've still got issues. The uncertainty being chief among them. Brendan, thank you so much. Brendan Murray there, who leads our trade and supply chain coverage globally. Now, the luxury sector has struggled of late. I know we've covered it on the program and more. That's coincided with fewer mentions of the big brands in popular music. So could analyzing songs actually help investors forecast the industry's fortunes. This was a really cool piece. Andrea Felsted from Bloomberg Opinion joins us now. Andrea, I mean, it's a quirky way to look at it, and it's so smart. So tell us what you were looking at here for your piece.
We really wanted to know if there was any relationship between mentions in songs and how the luxury brands were doing, and we found that there was.
I love it. This is such a Bloomberg story. It's like, we love metrics, we love data. So what does it tell us about the luxury sector?
It tells us that the luxury sector, as we know, had this incredible boom pretty much from sort of late 2020 to early 2023. And that really coincided with a spike in mentions of brands in popular music. We particularly focused on hip-hop and R&B because that was the genre that was most likely to mention luxury brands, but it was across the spectrum. And since then, they've really languished. And that's a worry for the industry because during that time, it really appealed to a more diverse, younger customer base, and many of those people have simply been priced out by the incredible price increases we've seen, and luxury really needs to get them back.
Yeah, it's funny. I can think of a couple of songs when mentioning like AP watches. I think
exactly
Vuitton was one.
Dior at the moment.
So Dior. So again, if you track that, does it really give us a sense of what people want to buy? Because it's inspirational or aspirational.
It really does. I mean, the really striking one is Gucci. They got a new designer in 2015, Alessandro Michele, who really changed the course of fashion at that time. It went from minimalism to maximalism. And around 2016, the mentions really started to take off. And they peaked around 2018-19, which was peak Gucci. And that really should have been a sign that we were at peak Gucci and maybe things needed to change. And Kering left it a bit late until 2022 when they changed designer, and the mentions have really languished since then. So it shows, how much work they've got to do. But the fact that it was so big in music, should give them hope, because Alessandro really leaned into that. He was very close to Harry Styles, and they used a lot of musicians. They've got a new CEO. He could really lean back into that again, because LVMH, which was, really at the forefront of this by appointing Virgil Abloh, who wasn't a musician, but he was very close to a lot of musicians. That really inspired a lot of customers, but they've switched to sport. So, for Kering, it's a really big opportunity to push back into that sector where it was once so strong.
Yeah, it's just so interesting, and I've never really read anything like it. Andrea, anything, are we back to maximalist, or are we still at minimalist?
Quiet luxury is still here, but I think quiet luxury has peaked. So we've got new designer at Gucci. We've got Demna, who's coming into Gucci. Prada's just bought Versace. So I was actually in London a few weeks ago, and I noticed a very cool girl in Hoxton with some Versace sunglasses, and I was like, wow, I wonder if this is the start of Versace. It's only one person, but I think we're going to see a bit more of a move back to maximalism, just because fashion's so fickle, and we've been in quiet luxury for such a long time that it probably needs a bit of a change.
Okay, so you see, if you spot a Versace sunglasses wearing youngster anywhere, please message Andrea. That's going to be our new index for the next column. Andrea, thank you. As always, Andrea Felsted, our Bloomberg Opinion columnist. Coming up, of course, a lot of the focus will be on trade, Alaska, with Trump meeting Vladimir Putin tomorrow. The other thing we're watching out for is actually a couple of market moves. I think the U.S. 2-year yield is on the verge of falling to the lowest level since May. Again, U.S. short-dated bonds seem to be nearing their lowest level in more than 3 months. It's, I guess, a conviction amongst traders that the Fed will cut interest rates next month. This is Bloomberg.